with a design practice, I guess on the engineering side, I'll add, right, one thing, this is a really interesting comparison, kind of, when I was there, right, had like 700 in-house tools to calculate carbon, right? Because everyone's got to go, oh, well, this is so-and-so's tool, and I've got to pull it apart and make sure it's right and make sure the 7 decimal places are right and put it back together, and I may as well just do my own. And all of a sudden you have all these iterations of ways to calculate carbon, right? Which is, it's thorough. But on the flip side, you bring a carbon tool into a place like Hassell, and before you can even go, hey, someone's grabbed it, run off with it, and they're banging away on it and going, yeah, great, how can I use it? This is amazing, right? Which is, so, like, I guess there's the thoroughness and the curiosity and collaboration around problem solving in an engineering organization. Then there's a just speed to, yeah, great, let's go use it. Yep. Okay, we've got an answer, kind of thing. So maybe it's a speed and a culture around that.
So we're here today with Sam Peart at the studios of Hassell in Melbourne, and we're going to talk about sustainability and building. Sam, you come from engineering background, yeah?
I do.
You were at Arup for quite a few years. I'm interested in starting off the conversation, first of all, by you saying for a minute who you are and what's the journey that's taken you to here. A little short summary.
No problems. I am currently the Global Head of Sustainability for Hassell. So that means looking after sustainability and regenerative design and outcomes in all its senses. So from our kind of corporate ESG piece, which is pretty kind of standard, so things like our B Corp certification, climate active certification, all those bits and pieces, through to our foresight around regenerative futures. So we've got someone developing a platform on that front. And then also at the core, our design and our design process and our projects, and also who we partner and work with. So it's an all-encompassing piece of work, and I've got a kind of team of people that are much more experienced and much more interesting than me.
You might you might call it a kind of endless job. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. They've got me locked in. So
you've come from, as I said, engineering, and you were at Arup for quite a while.
I was.
And I'm interested in two initial kind of questions around work approach, both in terms of that move, I guess, from an engineering environment to a design studio. Obviously, there's quite a distinct culture in the world of engineering and from the world of design. And I think this will come back to the question of sustainability,
sure,
because the way those two sectors work with each other might be quite important. So could you, in your own words, talk about that transition or arriving here in Hassell? What are the key things that are a bit different that you find a bit maybe challenging, but also what are the kind of opportunities that you see coming from an engineering background into a design studio?
Sure. So I think I kind of look at it as totally like two triangles that are totally flipped in the opposite direction, if you like, which, can be quite pointy and different, but also there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in it. I was with Arup in their sustainability team for just under 15 years, and I was lucky enough to work in their Sydney office at the kind of centre of a few disciplines in their buildings team around optimisation, and worked at lots of scales there. Then I went through to Singapore and was really focused on taking the technical bits and making sure they were really solid, but then transitioning that to city strategy, because Singapore obviously they're on a rolling city strategy basically, so it was about kind of scaling that. And then moved across to Los Angeles, and then it was about bringing specialists together around a problem and finding like-minded architects to go and work with, which is, kind of stepped me a little bit closer. And then I came back to Melbourne to lead the sustainability team for Arup in Melbourne after all of that. So it gave me quite an interesting view across different contexts and cultures, and trying to apply the same types of skills and solve the same types of problems with different kind of clients and in different contexts with different regulation as well, which is very interesting. And then, you're right, as I went through kind of between there and here, I think this was actually one of the most critical hats for me to wear in between the transition between an engineering culture and a design culture was that hat of the client, right? And Development Victoria was a really interesting place to do that because it was both government and developer. And so what you get to see in that is you get to see how government works. And they obviously had, Development Victorian agency, so they make a lot of decisions in-house around kind of investment because they have their own balance sheet, which gives a bit more freedom. And it was small enough to get across all projects. So I could see development across a number of sectors, but also see how that may or may not impact policy. And the relationship between projects and policy within government. But also, because you've got land that you want to develop, all the private sector developers are quite friendly and quite happy to kind of share and collaborate, because that's another role of the government development agency, is to collaborate with the private sector. So I actually got to see it from multiple angles. And I think what those two things did quite nicely was framing, one, that every role around a problem in the built environment is different, but equally as important, I would say. And coming in, it made me step back first to understand how Hassell worked and what their role is around the table, rather than me sitting across the table in different kind of ways over the years.
Yeah.
Before kind of jumping in and figuring out how to evolve the space here. And I think the difference for me, how to articulate is a really interesting one, right? Like engineering, being inside Arup for so long, you're incentivized to collaborate around a problem. It's always kind of, you're kind of thinking about this kind of mad person around trying to solve this problem, going, right, I need one of these people and one of these people. Oh, and I'll call that person from LA. And I remember that guy moved to London and she's up in Sydney and she's a specialist here, and everyone's excited to get round and kind of tear it all apart and put it back together. But they also get to the project typically at a point where lots of decisions have been made upstream. And so there can be this tension of why we're re-prosecuting all these things now that we've got all these engineers at the table. And I see that here, right? Like, and sometimes I actually feel like that when I'm sitting across the table as part of, like, I guess the Hassell team is and kind of I can talk about collaboration, doing projects differently a little bit later. But then with a design practice, I guess on the engineering side, I'll add, right, one thing, this is a really interesting comparison, kind of, when I was there, right, had like 700 in-house tools to calculate carbon, right? Because everyone's got to go, oh, well, this is so-and-so's tool, and I've got to pull it apart and make sure it's right and make sure the 7 decimal places are right and put it back together, and I may as well just do my own. And all of a sudden you have all these iterations of ways to calculate carbon, right? Which is, it's thorough. But on the flip side, you bring a carbon tool into a place like Hassell, and before you can even go, hey, someone's grabbed it, run off with it, and they're banging away on it and going, yeah, great, how can I use it? This is amazing, right? Which is, so, like, I guess that there's the thoroughness and the curiosity and collaboration around problem solving in an engineering organization. Then there's a just speed to, yeah, great, let's go use it. Yep. Okay, we've got an answer, kind of thing. So maybe it's a speed and a culture around that. And then I think there's a
really interesting. Yeah,
there's a bit of a where people spend their time is also quite interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I've got a feeling there's a bit behind that. How are people spending time that may not be the most productive?
Look, I think it still is productive and valuable, but I think there's a knack in articulating the value of design, right? I've been in conversations internally with the AIA and some researchers as well recently around in a market that is now quite streamlined into how they deliver projects. And this is problems we came up against with Development Victoria as well, in one, articulating the value of design, but two, creating space for it up front. And that's something that I didn't appreciate as well when I came in here, but really working with our heads of design and our design teams around how we evolve our design process to solve systemic challenges as opposed to just a closed brief that's been put in front of us. It's made me understand and appreciate the value of design a lot more.
And this comes back to, you just used the term where you are upstream and downstream in a process. And I've got a feeling that that's quite a big issue in terms of how you get sustainable outcomes. And so far as you say, quite often by the time an architectural practice is engaged, there's been 16, 18, 25 big decisions being made, and that would significantly limit your capacity to then kind of engineer into that process the kind of sustainability. How do you, in a context where the market flows, how capital gathers around projects and how they develop, what are the novel ways that you can try and seed good thinking earlier upstream in the process before you're getting into pretty pictures?
This is one thing that actually attracted me to Hassell in the first place. So Hassell do have a strategy team, quite focused around kind of commercial and workplace, but they do they go broader than that. But they do work with clients upstream, so they help in the briefing process, and help integrate those sorts of questions and provocations into the decision making that sets the brief that goes to market. So that's one way. The other way is we do have a culture of insights-driven design, and we do have an in-house research team. And so investing in that research, and there's a couple of pieces out there, the workplace surveys that we do every year, the adaptive reuse study that Ingrid Backer took to market not long ago, those sorts of pieces are pieces we can take into current or future client organisations, with or without partners as well. And we do usually end up with partners around these things, to ask the questions further upstream.
Yeah.
So how does this sort of information and these sorts of provocations with an evidence base change the way that maybe you'll come to market next time with your next project?
Yeah. And that's interesting because there's been a long running conversation within the profession around how you capture knowledge and bring that into the next project. And you just mentioned your report on workplace. That ability, I suppose the scale of a practice to be able to resource that idea of what have we just done, how has that worked, come back to it 3 years later, come back to it 5 years later, see how it works. That's one of the big issues, I think, with the meshing together of sustainability objectives and design objectives. That very often the design objectives kind of done when the building's done. At least that's the way architecture has been construed. You kind of build it and you walk away and say, look at my lovely thing. Whereas sustainability is very much about the whole lifestyle, the whole life cycle, and the operational performance, programming, etc. of the building. And that's not something that architecture often captures in its practices.
Yeah, I would say, and I use the word traditionally carefully because I think at some point it did, and I think it moved away from that for a while. But I think with the emergence of social value and social impact and evaluation of nature and the importance of nature coming back into the conversation at a rapid pace, that's going to start to change, right, again. And we see that through a lot of the work that John Hazelwood is doing in the landscape space. He, if you talk to him almost about post-occupancy evaluation for plants, so why did things work or not, going back to projects and that changing the way he works moving forward. And the research that we're currently doing with our research team that we published with the Green Building Council, that we're now working with partners like Social Traders and Social Ventures Australia, who are specialists in the space where we're not, is actually, if we're going to do this properly, we need to have a relationship with this place based on the role that we have after practical completion, after we typically hand the keys back.
Yeah. I think that's the kind of the first, in terms of this conversation, the first really interesting thing to note is this, the collaboration that is infused in all your language around your teams, and bringing in different experts in different fields and cross-institutional relationships as well. That's one of the kind of, seems to be one of the key things, because if there was one thing you might say that has limited the capacity of design to respond to sustainability in the past is having too narrow a focus on where you begin, or where design begins and ends. And in a sense, you can't really think like that when you think about sustainability.
Absolutely, and I don't think we can think about that when we think about design either, right? And it should always be intertwined. It should be in everything we do. I mean, part of the focus of the role coming in was never to establish at Hassell an ESD consultancy, right? Because their sustainability is such a broad topic. Like the way that we look at it covers site, place, nature, all the bits of carbon, social resilience time as well is really important when we look at it. And there's a lot of experience required to deal with such a broad topic, right? So it was never about us going, right, well, we'll have all that in-house, and we'll close it all out, because it would take years, right, to build that.
And it would evolve
Right.
all the time.
So it was always about us getting really good based on the successes we've had and the successes that partners have had, and that, parts of my team have had as well, is how do we get really good at upskilling enough to work with all of those specialists in a really quick, upstream, effective, respectful and authentic way.
It's quite a journey, and I think there are some changes happening in the industry, but maybe a little bit slowly. You mentioned the this idea of an ESD team being kind of a bit crazy in and of itself, because it will always be dynamic and it will be expansive and it'll be complex and always changing. It reminds me that I guess when I first started looking at sustainability 25 years ago, there was a time where there was architecture and then there was sustainable architecture, and there was architecture awards and there was sustainable architecture awards, and there was this thing called ESD, and there was a little object over there that you referred to now and again. Back then, I think most of the attention was on, I guess, what you'd call operational sustainability. So what's the air quality moving through the building to help cool the building? What are the materials? What are the kind of coolth and warmth in the materials? What kind of energy use, etc. So there's a lot of attention to that, and quite often that just moved into what have you got on the roof? Do you think we'll move on to embedded energy and embedded carbon in a minute? But if we just look at operationally, how much you've been involved for 20 years or more, in your time, how much have we got better at understanding the operational side of buildings as a kind of base load, not as like the special building over there that gets an award, but across sectors and across building types? Are we much better than we were 20 years ago?
I think we are, and I think there's evidence to show that. So that's where I started, was in that optimization, engineering heavy piece. And it was kind of separated. It only ever came together through really the facade and the services in a building, right? And if you got a really special project, maybe you'd start talking about comfort. And then if, right, a day like visual and thermal comfort, and it was like, wow, exciting. We get to do some more optimization.
There are humans in the building and they have to be comfortable.
But I think if you look at things like average neighbours' energy ratings over time, if you look at the evolution of the Green Star rating scheme over time, if you look at the uptake of renewable energy over time, that those are all evidence points that we've gotten a lot better, right? And you look at the new technology that's come to market, but then also become affordable to get into buildings over time. And they're all really clear evidence points that over the last 2.5 decades, that we have gotten a lot better at understanding it, but also delivering on it, and finding ways to do it cost effectively. And that's not just engineering, it's not just architecture, it's not just technology, it's not just suppliers, it's not just advocacy bodies, it's all of that working together.
Yeah, right. Okay. Now you have a role in Passive House. Are you what are you again?
I am on the board of the Australian Passive House Association.
You might be able to answer a simple question for me. What is it with Germany that it gets to kind of do this so well and put its word on the international
engineers run everything? No, strike that.
Passive House? It's like it's a word that we all know. It's a German word. Why are the Germans so good at this?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Look, I think I can only talk from my perspective, and I've not worked in Germany, but I can talk about the different roles that I saw play out over 20 years in sustainability in Australia, in Asia, and in the US, and the relationship between architects and engineers. And their relationship then to sustainability and what sustainable design was very different. Whereas, again, I think that was a divergence that happened at a point in time after it started in a really, if you go all the way back, right, architectural engineering, architects and engineers, same person typically. Right?
Yeah.
All the way back. I don't think, from my experience, that divergence happened as severely in Europe as it did
Yeah.
potentially in the market over here.
And I guess historical exemplars like the Bauhaus
Yeah.
feed into that narrative very, very well. So I guess we have over recent years, thankfully, begun to pick up the game in terms of what the buildings are made of and where they come from and how they are used for how long and reused, etc. And so then we get into away from operational, which is how much energy and water and whatever the services that we're using, into actually what it take to make a building. Where do you think we are on that in Australia compared to the rest of the world, in terms of the buildings that we make, the ethics behind the materials, the supply chains, and the sustainable story behind that? Are we in the top third, middle, somewhere in the middle, bottom third? Because I know that I will say in advance that in an earlier conversation a little while ago, I remember sticking in my head, I think Australia is just next to China in terms of the quantity of materials and carbon emissions per capita. Um, we have been pretty bad. Are we getting any better?
Look, no is the short. Well, I mean, we are getting better, but
But
it's
not any
taken
better than the rest of the world.
no, and it's taken a long time to get here. I think there is a groundswell of movement, instead of a groundswell of talking now, which is really great. But I did my first life cycle assessment on a building. It would have been in 2007. I was working with the owners and designers of a product called LCA Design, and it was connecting through an IFC file into early versions of Revit.
An IFC file?
It's a kind of a file convention that allowed this software to talk to Revit at the time,
Okay.
rather than just being able to plug right in. And I was at Arup. It was actually a Hassell building, 123 Albert Street in Brisbane, that Arup was working with Hassell on at the time. And I went and did a study on how to automate LCA in buildings through this test with the LCA design group.
Life cycle analysis.
Life cycle analysis. Yep. And yeah, so 20 years ago that was happening. I was going to lots of talks and events on why it was so hard, why there was not a lot of data available, how we could incentivize suppliers to provide data and understand their supply chains. I had diagrams of, as our buildings get more efficient, embodied emissions or upfront emissions, get more important. And that was in 2007. We were still having those conversations, I'd say 3 years ago here.
Right.
I think neighbours taking the charge on the neighbours embodied carbon tool, and that, there's proven success in disclosure, either mandatory or voluntary, and then ratings, and then that becoming a value-based decision-making tool for consumers or tenants or whoever you like. So I think that will change a lot. I think MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, has done a lot to kind of push it along as well. And I think kind of the Green Building Council and their advocacy roles and leveraging the tools that they have helped. And again, that's all through a lot of collaboration between a lot of those organisations.
Yeah. You mentioned neighbours a few times, and for some, that doesn't mean the person living next door. It's a rating tool. Can you tell me, does that apply equally across the building sector, or are there certain aspects of the building sector that neighbours kind of really has an impact on?
I'd say the first sector that there was really an uptake in was the commercial sector. It was an easy differentiator for marketing of commercial buildings to tenants.
Yeah.
And since then has grown out across multiple sectors. So I'd say the commercial sector is the easiest one to see where there has been change. But neighbours, it does apply, across multiple sectors.
Because that was the same with the Green Star as well.
Correct.
That it was started with commercial and then it's built up forward. And in some ways, the reason for that might be that the result on net lettable income that you have from a building that's good quality, that has all the higher performing buildings, immediately hits the bottom line, whether you're a superannuation fund or
Absolutely.
a property owner.
For all stakeholders, right?
Yeah. And but the larger it is, you might say, the more their capital interest is year by year over 20 years to do that. Whereas, I don't know, building a single family home It's very often about how do I get the key in the door as fast as possible and, bugger the 7% savings a year.
Absolutely.
How do we how do we solve that? How do we get there?
How do we get there?
In a situation, just to rephrase it in a way, in a situation where the long-term drivers that help someone building a $100 million building out there to understand the long-term return versus the short-term, small-scale, we've got to have this building, which applies as much, you might say, to schools where you've
Yeah.
got really, really lean budgets and the nether of 15-year returns or even 10-year returns. How do we make an inroad to that? Because that's a very big part of our built environment.
Absolutely. I think, look, lots of, there's probably a lot of different elements around smaller scale. I think the general incentive for all, actually most stakeholders around that scale of building is not there because there is no return, because it is still an investment at that scale, right? It's a lot easier to, take the ute, go down the Bunnings, get the stuff you need and come back, right? Which
Yeah.
even on large scale projects, so if you look at projects trying to undertake the Living Building Challenge, which look at materials down to the glue and adhesive you're using to stick the carpet down to the floor,
Yeah.
even on large scale buildings, run out of adhesive, go down to the hardware store, that can trip up, right? And that's what's happening on the smaller scale buildings for almost everything, right? And so I think maybe because the value, the initial value driver in this country at least, was those large scale commercial buildings, as differentiators make sense in the way that you were talking about,
Yeah.
that it hasn't translated, right? And so maybe it needs to translate through volume building first. So when I was working at Development Victoria, that's where we targeted the shift because there's scale.
Yeah, yeah. I think we will get on in a way that kind of like leads to kind of policy, I suppose, and we'll get on to policy in a second. But maybe there are a range of materials out there. If we can talk a bit more about sustainable, about circularity and about reusing buildings. But in terms of, like, you might say, virgin materials, new products out there, there's a few things I was interested in your kind of relatively quick response to, because there's a lot of conversation around these. So one there's about three or four of them. One of them is low carbon concrete. Is that such a thing? Is it possible? How is it possible? And is it really going to transform the use of concrete?
So concrete, so yes, is the short answer, and it is recycled or reclaimed material in the supply chain combined with renewable energy to produce the thing. The more of those two things we have, the cleaner the product, and it can happen for concrete, steel, lots of different materials.
Yeah.
So yes, it can, absolutely.
To what extent are you optimistic that the concrete that we use will get to that spot where, I mean, first of all, scalability. Imagine you have a perfect scenario. You've got reused concrete, you've got renewable energy, put them together. Presumably we're not talking zero carbon emissions, but how much does it reduce the carbon intensity of concrete?
I think in the concrete industry at the moment, we've almost, I think you start to bring real zero. So everything that's happening is run on. So all of the mining, all of the transport, all of the reclaimed kind of material, all of the reprocessing, all of the processing, all of the shipping, transport, construction.
So scope 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah. Everything's running on renewable electrical energy.
Yeah.
Or green hydrogen for fuels for larger transport.
Yeah.
We're not there as an industry yet, but the rhetoric has shifted. Yeah. If you look at some of the work that Beyond Zero Emissions is doing around the transformation of Australia's economy, there's lots of research around renewable energy zones crossing over with innovation precincts. So areas like the Hunter.
Yeah.
And if you look at even kind of, and this can get, it requires a much longer conversation, but we have a studio in Perth. So we look at, there's lots of mining clients out there. And so we do a lot of due diligence on our clients. But you look at the change in rhetoric over time from the Fortescue Metals Group, and they have essentially claimed ownership and responsibility for quite a large proportion of Australia's emissions,
Yeah.
and have pushed away offsets and said our target is real zero, and it's throughout our entire supply chain. So what their claims are about now is taking the money they would have invested in offsets and actually re-injecting it back into their own supply chain to clean it up and get to a zero product.
So they're not in the business of planting a million trees in some unknown corner of South America, and hopefully that it's going to suck out some carbon. But having said that, didn't Twiggy recently say that his dreams of green steel or green hydrogen steel have been set back?
They have been set back. Yep. So that came out as well. And so I think there are setbacks in this industry have always been technological, economic, or because people don't want to get around the table and talk about something and do something different.
Yeah.
I probably don't have the experience to talk about scale in terms of, I guess, I don't work for a mining or a mineral resources company. So I can't really talk about that scale, but when those changes happen, they happen big, and it makes it really easy to make key decisions at the building or the built environment scale.
Yeah.
But over time, they keep happening. Like, they haven't stopped happening in the 25 years I've been around. And there is still, what also hasn't changed is the rhetoric around differentiation and the marketing around trying to attract clients to those industries because they're better for the environment or better for people or better for nature.
Yeah.
So if that's kind of a view on, I don't see it slowing down, even though there might be in those areas technological and economic barriers.
Yeah.
I think that it's only increased since I've been in the industry.
Well, you quite rightly say that it technological and economic, and as my understanding is that one of the big issues with green hydrogen is the cost of energy, and in a way you could say that cost of energy is a political choice, like the degree to which energy is regulated and how it's regulated and how much is sent overseas versus domestically, that could change quite radically depending on government policy. And so it seems to me that if the price was different for energy, then all of a sudden it become possible. And the fact that Twiggy said I can't do it, it's just because the cost of energy is too high, which is
it is interesting, right? Because it's the same conversation at a different scale and with a different subject matter that we had when we had some developers, some investor representatives, the City of Melbourne and the State of Victoria, right here in this room actually, debating over why we can't turn office buildings into homes in the middle of a housing crisis.
Right.
Same thing.
Let's get on to that.
Where we got to, because I facilitated that debate, and we did have it as a debate. I had some strict instructions, but still, it was a debate.
I'm interested to know who was debating against it, but we'll get on to that.
Well, we did have two teams.
Right.
But where we got to, and the room was full, right? And we had lots of audience participation. It was off the back of that research piece. But it came down to a stalemate between invest in the research to come and tell us what you want so private sector, come to us, public sector, go and invest in the research and tell us what you need, versus, and we're happy to make changes, right? Versus, well, why should we take the risk? Why don't you change the policy and change the policy, tax reform, regulation, and we'll come and invest here.
Yeah. So kind of classic supplier demand in a way.
Absolutely. It was opposing magnets. That's what
Maybe we just back up a little bit and talk about that work that Ingrid Backer kind of led. So could give us a quick overview of that work in terms of the research that was involved and what was the objective?
Sure. So in the midst of obviously there was a lot of headlines around housing crisis, housing supply issues, in particular in the state of Victoria, in the media. Absolutely there is. As well as issues around carbon, environment, and then the next to those two. So how do we increase housing demand while also getting to zero? And at the same time, the occupancy rates in Melbourne were quite low, right? So there wasn't a lot of people in the city tenancy rates were very low. So Ingrid led a piece of work. She looks after our commercial workplace sector. Did a joint piece of work with our residential sector leader to think about, well, what if we had a look at all of the unoccupied buildings in the Melbourne CBD, and looked at what it would take to change those into residential buildings, into housing, to help deliver on some of the state targets.
Yeah, and I believe there were some parameters such as the floor, the depth of the floor plate, which of course then leads into access to natural light, because of course office buildings have a less demanding requirement in terms of access to natural light.
Yeah, so they got to finding 86 buildings across the Melbourne CBD.
86.
That were built before 1990. There was a different structural integrity, and they were more likely to be B and C, D grade buildings that maybe weren't occupied or that needed investment to renovate anyway. So there was already an investment required to get them up to tenancy.
Yep.
Buildings that had about a 25-metre floor plate, so that you could have 2 apartments.
Double loaded.
Yep.
Yeah.
On either side, or an apartment on either side of a corridor. And then buildings that were over 10 stories. So typically they had the structural capacity to take a little bit more load, which meant we could get a bit more yield, which again supports investment.
And that would presumably have been the offer to government, say, give us an extra 6 floors and we'll give you residential.
And that's what came out of it, right? So after that initial piece of research was done, a pilot project was analysed with technical partners and with financial partners, and it very much was the return on investment was below typical hurdle rates. And so there was recommendations and conversation around things like planning regulation and tax reform.
So it all sounds very exciting. It sounds like there was a kind of, I guess you'd call it residual land value, or at least the market stacks up to do that. There was and there continues to be considerable vacancy in offices. What's happened? Why didn't government say, this is a great idea, let's proceed and do this?
I would say conversations are still being had.
Right.
But
because this isn't an emergency after all.
Well, that's probably the other reason, right? Is it's still quicker and easier. So there was no technical barriers, but the change in, I don't know if you've ever tried to change a policy. Either inside an organisation or inside government.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So as this has happened, the housing crises, right? Multiple crises of living have gotten a lot worse.
Yeah.
And so now a lot of you kind of get the sentiment from a lot of state government mandates now, and what they're saying is just get it done. Get it built, get it done.
Yeah. However, we can sort of walk and chew, yeah? So you can do that.
100%.
And you get the market saying, just give us these levers here and we'll just leave us alone. We'll do that.
I don't disagree.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Maybe we'll leave that for a moment. I guess so that does lead on, however, to not so much change of use from commercial to residential, which has all sorts of possibly complexity, but can be solved. To adapting and reusing existing offices for new offices, because I don't know do you know where the phrase came that the most sustainable building is the building that's already built?
I think it's got to have come from, I think I've read it in a McKinsey
report. Was it German?
Reference from a different report.
Okay.
I'd go down that supply chain rabbit hole.
So,
maybe that's
so Confucius 2,000 years ago said. So, but nevertheless, there is a strong move towards how you hold on to the carbon that's already been invested in buildings. And there are parts of the world, I believe, where it's now creeping into the planning code, where you have to demonstrate that.
Seeing that in London?
Yeah, in London has done that now, so that if you're going to knock a building down, you have to demonstrate how you're going to essentially recoup the carbon lost in that process. So that's a good thing that we're seeing. So Hassell recently took on a project called the Michael Kirby Building, which was an old building that you've renovated and brought back to life again. Do you want to talk a little bit, take us through that process?
Sure. So the Michael Kirby building is the law school at Macquarie University in New South Wales in Sydney, and the building was an old administration building, essentially with a bit of an outdoor central courtyard. And what the team have done is kind of breathe new life into it with mass timber structure, and turn that courtyard into an atrium. Now with it's essentially lots of different uses, but have kind of brought it back to life in order to have it be a kind of aligned facility for the law school at Macquarie University.
Right. Okay. Now you made that sound very easy, but from what I understand, there are difficulties in doing that. One of which is the kind of in the OHR calls it the kind of dark matter of like planning and certification and regulation and insurance, but there is that issue to deal with when a builder builds a core and then they build a building around it and all the insurances are all wrapped up in that builder building that core, and then you come along and say, well, we're going to take it all back and we're going to start from a primary structure and work forward. It can get complicated, can it, in terms of certification and whose insurance, if a thing falls over or if it's a problem, who's liable at that point. Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, look, there's lots, like we came across a lot of issues around structural integrity. That's always really important. Part of what kind of Ingrid found through working with the structural engineering for pre-1990s buildings is that over time there's compaction and you actually get a little bit more strength in the concrete. And they were built to different codes, which is really interesting.
Right. So the classic line that they used to build it better, in a way.
Absolutely.
Right.
There can be, I guess, timber is used quite a lot to expand existing structures because it's lighter weight to put on top of existing structures. That can come with its own fire issues and regulations. There's heritage they have to think about. There's servicing, particularly if you're changing the use of the building. So yeah, there's lots of bits and pieces that kind of need to be overcome.
Yeah.
But I think, and part of what came out of Ingrid's study, I guess part of what kind of the guys thought about and very early on with the Michael Kirby building, and something that we were pushing really hard when I was at Development Victoria is pulling the problem solving up front. And it's, what we found in all three of those projects, so the project I did at Development Victoria and the two other projects, our clients were willing to get people around the table early to understand those problems and try and solve them early. So they didn't become roadblocks to the actual project itself.
Yeah.
By going through a normal procurement process.
So if I could turn a question, I guess, around on itself and say, why doesn't everyone do that?
Because we are, as an industry, trained to procure a project a certain way, where we are obsessed with speed at all costs and don't necessarily understand that slowing a project down maybe only means 2 weeks before you go out for your initial consultant procurement, not 3 months, and that can actually save you time at the end. In-house acquisitions teams maybe aren't made up of the right kind of skill sets anymore. Maybe investment committee guidelines need to shift. And I've had a couple of conversations in industry about that happening as well. So the way that we value buildings or value assets.
Yeah.
And there's all these little bits along the life cycle of a project that we're not incentivized to change.
Yep.
Right? Yep. Or necessarily, I would say, trained to do. Like it's a different project delivery model, in the same way that if you're going to design, a space or a building with all non-virgin materials, so you're going to source it all not off the shelf, but from recouped places, which is we're doing a couple of those projects at the moment. You got to turn the design process on its head, right? Yeah. And the first 2 or 3 goes at that is hard and it's exhausting, and you mess up. But once you get it right, kind of you can get into the right swing of things. Yeah,
and also just we are in an architecture office, and it is true that generally speaking, the convention around how architects get paid is as a percentage of the construction value.
Yep.
So you not only are you not incentivized, you're actually incentivized to spend as much. I mean,
as much money
I'm
as
sure there are ethical architects, but there is a total conflict of interest right there, isn't there? Yeah.
And I think so. It's actually a really interesting research project. Maybe I'll just kind of jump off for a couple of years and go and do that. But there are, just from sitting around the table with so many different hats on, there are so many micro points where something small just could shift, right?
Yeah.
And it would change the answer, not in terms of how much money people make, probably, or the speed at which we could get an outcome, but it would definitely change maybe who the hero was. But it will also change the outcomes for people and nature at the end for the better.
Yeah. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but I do have three kind of what ifs for you. The first one, you mentioned how hard it is to change policy, and yet we also know that policy is so at the heart of kind of possible solutions. If I was to give you a wish, if I was your fairy godmother, and say you get to change one policy, what policy would you choose to create better and more sustainable outcomes in buildings?
I would probably find a way to shift the planning scheme. I think that's where a lot gets held up.
Yeah.
At least that's where a lot of the pain point, we hear a lot of the pain point for our clients in terms of being able to, if we could do it quicker, we could do it faster, or if we had more certainty, then we could do that.
Right. Okay. Planning.
Yeah. The other one would be housing, and just getting on with improvements to housing quality.
Okay. And is that in relation to the operational sustainability of the building over time, or is that to do with the construction or the whole thing?
The whole thing, the quality of housing, particularly given we're going to put a whole bunch of housing up, or we say we are, over the next decade. I got to Development Victoria and was told it can't be done. We can't make it better because the volume builders know what they're doing and builders know what they're doing, and it's too expensive, it's too hard, and we're not incentivized. This was before the 7-star NatHERS argument was happening in industry. So I just went, what would it take to get to 7 stars, right? We'll take a step and then we'll see how much we can go beyond there.
Yeah.
Worked with 4 volume builders that Development Victoria were part of the pool of volume builders that we work with on a regular basis. Used a few projects and a few procurement processes, and we went from 30 grand a house to 10 grand a house to 0 in 3 procurement cycles.
In terms of added cost?
In terms of added benefit for free.
Okay.
So a 7-star going from 6-star to 7-star.
Yeah.
NatHERS, so it is about the thermal efficiency and energy efficiency cost, then cost to run of the home.
Yeah.
But by working with the volume builders and using procurement processes, the initial cost came back at $30,000 a home. The second time we did it, they came back with $10,000 a home, and the third time we did it, it was free.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Does that mean those volume builders are going to now deploy?
They have been.
They have.
Yeah.
Right.
So part of their marketing is we can do it.
Right. Okay. That's pretty amazing. But you had 2 policy wishes there, so
sorry.
that.
I'm so greedy.
So another.
That the entire design team is around the table at the beginning of a project. And when I say the beginning of a project, I mean when feasibility is being tested by a client.
Right. Okay. And that goes back to the very beginning of this conversation around upstream, downstream. Actually having design intelligence right early in the process. Design
and technical intelligence, and then with the economic intelligence at the beginning of the project.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's when you can separate the purpose of the project from the function that ends up coming out in a brief.
Yeah.
So you can leverage purpose to challenge function. It's when you've got all the right heads around the table to say, don't use that benchmark. You're going to lock yourself into this. That's an old benchmark. You're going to lock yourself into that.
Yeah.
You might need to procure differently if that's the outcome that you want. And that can be done quite rapidly from experience, having that intelligence upstream in a way that's been exposed to multiple different parts of the industry. I've seen the difference between an in-house team and bringing externals in that are maybe working for 15 different clients, right? Having that exposure helps things move rapidly.
And that may even connect back to changes in planning policy.
Yes.
Because, of course, there's a timing involved in planning policy and the degree of commitment you have to commit to certain moves before you get there.
Absolutely.
So that they might be connected. You're working here in Australia, which, as we said earlier on, is not a poster boy or poster girl of sustainable building. It's doing better and it's getting better, but it's still hard. I imagine your job is quite hard from time to time. So the last hypothetical is that if you were to move to anywhere in the world that made your job much easier, where would you move to?
Oh, easier, but then it wouldn't be
more
easy.
enjoyable.
Oh, right. So it's easy.
Where you could feel like you're getting more done with your knowledge.
Look, Europe has always been somewhere where you look to, right? I'm gonna be greedy again.
So I go to two places.
I'll,
Summer home in New York.
Yeah, I think like Europe has been incredible in setting the pace, right, for a very long time. I'm actually going to Copenhagen in June with World City.
The Danes.
World City, and they've organised quite a nice program for us to go and learn from those things, right?
Yeah.
So I'm super excited about that. What I really, I guess, enjoyed about designing in the US was that collaboration was a lot easier, actually. I really enjoyed being an engineer in the US, working with architects that would open their doors or call up immediately. And there was a really great design community. And it was a community of both architects and engineers.
Right.
And it kind of felt different, a little bit different to it does here. Like there is a lot of collaboration here, don't get me wrong. And I think the US has got, particularly on the West Coast, has got some really interesting resilience challenges coming up.
Yeah.
Which is a big area of interest of mine. But I also think that places like Asia are super interesting because there's an opportunity to leapfrog, right? What's going on everywhere else.
Yeah, yeah.
A huge opportunity.
Yeah. And again, you had three choices there. So as you say, low carbon concrete, green steel, there are technical and economic challenges. Another thing would be mass timber. Everyone is using mass timber. Everyone's talking about mass timber. I've also heard that if you were to actually convert all of the concrete buildings that are being built to mass timber, we would basically cut down every tree in the world.
Yeah.
A lot of them.
Yep.
So pros and cons, mass timber.
Well, for starters, you can't design a timber building the same way you design a concrete building.
Okay.
Different structural solutions, right? Because they're different materials.
Yeah.
So, pros and cons. At the right, there's lots of technology and now capability available for certain scales of buildings. Things like additions to existing buildings, like we talked about before. I think any solution. Look, we live in a systemic society.
Yeah.
We have systemic issues that we're dealing with. There is no silver bullet.
Yeah.
So if we see any solution as a silver bullet, it's going to cause a problem, right?
Yeah.
It's going to cause a huge problem.
Okay.
Like deforestation, biodiversity loss, supply chain issues, supply and demand issues, cost issues that will then eventuate, right?
Yeah.
So I think what we try and do here, at least, is assess every project on its merits across a number of different technological solutions, timber being one.
Yep.
And if timber is at the outset, if it makes sense for the client, for the scale of the project, for the location of the project, for the supply and demand that's going on in the industry at the time, for the cost of the technology and the material at the time, if that all makes sense, then we get the right talent in, we call the right structural engineer, we say, right, we've got to run two different designs to test out the difference between whatever other structural solution we're looking at and timber, so we can compare cost, speed of construction, which can be another one.
Yeah.
As well as kind of carbon and embodied in upfront carbon emissions.
Because one of the challenges we have with mass timber here is that obviously to set up an operation to do that well, there's not many of them around the world.
Mm.
You need a throughput of projects.
Correct.
And that's one of the challenges we had down in Geelong. We had a company that was doing it, but it just didn't have enough demand to keep those things going. So how do we solve that in a country like Australia? How do we get a sufficient supply requirement that drives that happening locally? Because you don't want to ship, there's a
Yeah.
kind of a craziness about shipping sustainable materials from across the world.
Well, it depends if you're putting it on a plane or on a boat, right? If
Okay.
you look at those carbon emissions, they're quite different.
Okay.
And if the boat goes to Perth and trucks it across, as opposed to
Yeah.
coming into Melbourne, also different.
Okay.
So this
So
is
it
why-
can be sustainable to harvest your timber from Sweden.
I mean, it can, but again, it's about evidencing that, right? And in comparison to what? And in answer to, I think it is, like chicken and egg, right? Comes back to policy, legislation, and incentive
Yeah.
versus private
Yeah.
sector trying to drive it, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think maybe, the example you talked about is private sector did, have a really good crack, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then maybe policy didn't get on board and take advantage of having industry in the right place at the right time to
Yep.
then incentivize
Yep.
a larger uptake.
It really is about the connection of government and industry understanding what the
Yeah.
opportunities are, because it's kind of heartbreaking. And I was involved in a project that did use a lot of mass timber, and the whole plan was to take it from this company, but in the end it came from across the world, which just seems like such a wasted opportunity. Talking about local materials, do you see much of a future in other natural building materials that, there's a long history of Stramit and use of straw. There's a growing conversation around the use of hemp and other things. Is that something that you feel excited about, or do you think it's a bit of a left field?
Oh, I am super excited about it, and where that excitement comes from is being able to work at all scales, from interiors to urban design here. So we're actually working on a couple of small projects at the moment. And the Advanced Manufacturing Readiness Facility did this in Sydney as well, right? They did use mass timber design for disassembly, but then started to look at, well, what about the rest of the materials? So things like rammed earth, recycled materials very much went into that project.
Right.
And looking at the way that we do interiors projects at the moment, a couple of smaller projects we're doing at the moment, we're trying to work with every single supplier to maximize the non-virgin material going in, and working to a hierarchy of if it's straight up repurposed, or if we can improve the value of the material by using it a different way, down to biomaterials or natural materials, materials that we can take from somewhere else and work with the supplier to reprocess into a different material for this particular use. The network of people that are out there doing this and that want to partner and are looking for scale as well.
Yeah. Give me an example of that, of taking something and upscaling it, upgrading it, upcycling it.
So without giving too much away, we're working with a few suppliers and designers at the moment for a small project that should happen in June this year. It's a temporary project, but we found one supplier with a whole bunch of offcuts. Offcuts
Steel or
of a product
of
their product.
Of their product, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And a designer who went, ooh, I can do something with that. I can do something very interesting with that. And I can turn it into a different product
Okay.
that I would usually sell as part of my business, right? It is my core design.
Right.
And it's my core business, and I can use this product as opposed to a virgin material.
Right.
And then if we're going to use this product, how do we make this the most recycled, most low carbon product it can be?
Yeah.
And take that to market. So taking something that was going to go in the bin,
Right.
and forged a partnership. One of our designers here actually forged that partnership.
Yeah.
And now we're looking at how do we turn it into something of higher value that goes back out into the market
Than the original stuff that was being made for. Okay, right. That's amazing. The last on my list of quick fire. How are we doing? It feels like forever we've been talking about prefabrication and how that can somehow, going back to the question of offcuts, that prefabrication, factory built, there's a kind of a leanness that you can bring to that. It seems to me, for as long as people have talked about it, that there's a no-brainer to it, and yet it doesn't happen. Why does it not happen, and what would it take to make it happen in a way that was more ethical with the use of materials?
I would say look out on the Hassell website for an opinion on this very, very soon.
Okay, right. Is it? It's too hot off the press to share, is it?
Look, it's what we're coming across is that it's been around since the beginning of
Dawn of time,
construction,
virtually. Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Our head of research, Daniel Davis, did a really interesting article on this back in 2020. We've looked at it for a couple of different projects as well. It's come up quite a lot in conversations we're having around the market, particularly in Sydney, where we're seeing a lot of BTR come to market.
Built to rent.
Yeah, build to rent. Sorry about that. And starting to understand the role of design in it, why it's failed previously, and how we can essentially help, right? If at all,
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of because you're right. It is a solution that needs to be successful
Yeah.
in order to solve a couple of these challenges at the same time.
Yeah.
And what we're finding is it is complex, right? There has been multiple points of failure and multiple reasons for that.
Yeah.
And there are multiple ways of thinking about modular design. So there is kind of unitized modular construction, but there's modular thinking that you can put into design, right, as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be non-customizable. It doesn't have to be every building looks the same or every product looks the same and you just put a facade over the top of it.
Yeah.
And so we are in conversation at the moment with trying to pull all this knowledge and experience together on understanding all those points of failure.
Right. Okay. Okay. So may there be solutions hiding somewhere in the ruins of that piece of research?
I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. I remember 25 years ago living in London. At the bottom of my street, there was a social housing development being put together, which actually was a lovely building in the end. And from foundation to what you would conventionally call lock-up, or you know, into kind of like finishing off the interiors, 21 days. 21 days,
Yeah.
and it was like, I don't know, 85 apartments, and it was trucks coming.
Yeah.
25 years ago, you think surely cost on site, wet trades, all that
Yep.
efficiency.
No rain delays, like waste,
Yeah.
maximize, optimize
Yeah.
material, everything.
Well, you've got to come up with a solution and then patent it. Okay.
You got it, boss. No problem.
All right. That's great. We'll get everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
So that's Sam Peart from Hassell, one of the largest architecture practices in the country. And yet she's an engineer. And I think that's an important clarification because she brings an engineer's thinking to the challenges that Hassell have to work through in relation to sustainability. And one of the things I find most fascinating about that is that there is a historic tendency for architecture design to be considered a thing that starts at the moment that you are given a design brief. Here's your design brief. It's a lovely brief. Go in, build a building. What Sam was talking about there is that well before that design brief is written, there's a whole series of steps along the way, right the way from where the investment money is coming from, what decisions are being made around that investment, the planning advice that they're getting along the way, and the decisions around that. There's a lot of steps that go into the development of a building before it's a design brief. And what she was saying, and what I was understanding her saying, is that what architecture and design needs to do is insert itself earlier in that upstream, up that process, because that's very often where the innovation happens, right at the early stages. It's not good enough to wait until there's a design brief. You need to get it right up there early. So I guess for me, the first takeaway from that conversation was to take something more of an engineer's attitude to say, not just wait for a design to be plunked on your design brief to be plunked on your desk, but actually how do we get design thinking further up that design that stream, because that's where the innovation happens. And if you do all those steps along the way, if you do bits of innovation along the way, then you have a starting point at the design brief that's really courageous. If you don't, and each one of those steps is business as usual, then you end up with a vanilla brief with very little room to move.
Yes, and fascinating to hear as an example of that, perhaps, her work with Development Victoria, where Sam led that procurement process for 6-star ratings. And in the first instance, accepting that there would be a cost perhaps a risk, maybe that's the same thing, that to get a 6-star rating would cost more, and then the second round of procurement, it cost less, and the third round of procurement, it was factored in, it was already normal. So to, on the client side, bring those ideas together and to see that change come through was fascinating to see, and perhaps indicative of the sort of shaping of the market that the government can do.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the role of government to be able to look at what is business as usual and then make a decision around how do we set targets beyond that. And when she described that example, I thought how interesting it was. With only 3 cycles of procurement, you take a series of home builders who, first of all, and it is the classic trope, isn't it? People think of sustainability as an extra cost. And so it's not surprising first time around the standard processes, they factor in risk because they haven't done this before, and that's what costs extra. But then they do something like that, and it's a bit more expensive. The second time around, there's less risk because they know kind of what they're doing, so it costs less. And within 3 cycles, they're delivering better quality, more sustainable buildings for the same price. And then what was really critical there is then they use that to market themselves. We do this as standard. This is our new normal. So I think that's exactly the role of government, to be able to use its role as a client, as a procurer of stuff, to lead and push the market rather than just meet the market, let's say, where it's at. Don't you think?
Absolutely. We also heard about the roundtable conversations they initiated with different actors in the market around repurposing of buildings in the city of Melbourne. And I found that fascinating because one of the big challenges that we know is ahead is that 68% of the world's population will end up living in urban environments by the year 2050. It's not long. And we need an awful lot more city infrastructure and city buildings. We need a lot more urban realm to accommodate that change. Yet we can't do that the way that we've done everything that's come before. So part of that might come through low carbon in concrete, and other supply might come in energy systems and so on. But to repurpose existing infrastructure and then explore what it would take for that to happen seems to be a very important part of that conversation. And I think reflected this holistic, joined together thinking that seems to be inherent in any effective solution as we look at climate adaptation going forward.
Totally. I did think it was an interesting little takeaway from the conversation, where they are looking at existing old buildings and doing research and analysis of old buildings and what can be retained and what has to be stripped out. And the idea that concrete that was poured maybe half a century ago, in fact, is not. Obviously, some buildings do get concrete cancer and other forms of decay, but failing that, quite often concrete gets stronger over time. And so therefore a building that might have been built of concrete to withstand 8 stories or 10 stories, it could be that after 50 years it can have another 2 or 3 stories, lightweight stories, put on top of it with the same structural integrity. So there are these kind of little surprises out there. They just need to have the right support, the right planning support, government support, client support. So once one person does something well, then I think more people will do it. It just takes leadership.
And this was very specific to the built environment, which was the area of investigation for Series 1. But I think a lot of what we just talked about is transferable, and it was reflected in our earlier conversations as well, that this approach is how we start reducing the silos and the barriers that are unintentionally slowing our progress towards climate adaptation.
Well, Sam, this is the last of the 5 interviews we've done in this first little climate relay, looking at 5 different aspects of the one thing. And what I'm really interested in is that we started with Dan. Dan made a point in his presentation, in his conversation, to say that the world's not short of people making innovations and doing smart things with sustainability, but quite often they're quite small scale. They're almost kind of cottage industry things. And very often they're not supported by government, quite the opposite, he would say. And over the series of conversations, when we talked to Frank and Joost at that beautiful school that they designed, you can see there's an opportunity of scaling up, and they talk about scaling up. When we talk to Doug, he's talking about this initial stab at at what to do with hemp and how to make it work, there's definitely opportunities to scale up. And you can see moving through the scale up factor is real. And in the case of Hassell, this is the big end of town. They typically design and deliver the biggest projects around, and they talk, as Sam talks, about the macro, about how are we going to adapt our cities, how are we going to take our existing stock. It takes real hard work. It will also take support from government. But based on that conversation, I am modestly optimistic that there is enough intent and knowledge and combined value that we can all see in that work that she's doing. So I think that's a pretty optimistic way to round off this first series of Climate 360.
I agree, and I also note that while there was a lot of it's the language of risk to look at insurance and to look at the markets in that large scale, that is also a big part of the powering force behind this change. There's a realization and a knowledge of the urgency and the need, the impact at all levels to improve our prospects as an economy, but also in our lives. So I think they all come together in a really compelling way.
Okay, well, that's it for this little series. Our next series is called Climate Positive, looking at a range of different people who are bucking the trend of depression and despondency in climate and doing real things of value in climate. So we hope you can join us in our next series of Climate Positive interviews.
Yep, looking forward to sharing those with you.